Okay, now we're continuing with AUC Section 315, gaining understanding of the entity and assessing the risk of material misstatement. Throughout the past couple of videos, we have been learning how to gain an understanding of the entity's internal control. And so far, it's just been kind of an overview of the internal control setups at organizations and how we might go about gaining an understanding of them. And so for this one, we'll learn how to determine which which controls are relevant to the audit. So as we discussed before, the entity has certain objectives that it wants to achieve, and in order to do that, they have controls in place that make it pretty likely that they will achieve those objectives. And each entity is a little bit different in the objectives that they want to achieve, and also the controls that they have in place to achieve them. But there's usually a general structure of how these are set up. So for instance, the objectives that they have might include financial reporting, operations, and compliance objectives. So they might want to report the results of their operations accurately. They also might want to be profitable and have efficient operations. And they also want to be in compliance with the laws and regulations that apply to them. So they'll have controls in place to achieve them. And so to kind of have a picture of this, I have this diagram here, and we see that there are basically three axes for the control environment here. So you've got the entity's objectives, which we just talked about. So their financial reporting, operations, and compliance. And they also have components of internal control that they have in place in order to hopefully achieve those objectives. And those will be having a good control environment, assessing the risk that they won't achieve these objectives, information and communications they have throughout the entity to achieve these objectives, control activities, and then monitoring these components to make sure that they are still properly designed and effective. And then on this third axis, we have the entity, which would tell us the different reporting units or the functions within the entity. So from this, it tells us that the different units and functions of the entity have different objectives, which also require different components and internal control policy. And so later on, we will go through each of these internal control components to get a better understanding of them. But for now, we just want to know that whenever we're gaining an understanding of the entity's internal control, we might not necessarily have to gain an understanding of everything related to this, like all the objectives or all the units or all of the components, or certainly need all the components, but drill down into the components. There might be stuff that is not relevant to our audit and our procedures. And so we'll learn a little bit more about how to determine that here. And so how to determine whether or not a control is relevant to our audit is certainly up to our professional judgment, but we have a list here of things that might tell us that a control is relevant. So if it pertains to an account that's material to our financial statements, perhaps, or if the control is related to a risk that is significant to us, if the size of the entity might come into play. So if it's a very small entity, the owner-manager might have a big hands-on role, which would be a major control in that organization. Also, the nature of the business, the diversity and complexity of the business, certain legal and regulatory requirements would make a control perhaps more relevant if there's a particular law related to that control. Or in the instance of entities receiving federal funds, there might be more relevant controls related to making sure that they comply with their grant agreements and such. And also the nature and complexity of their systems, and whether the control is related to things that might be material misstatements if it were not operating correctly. So we can kind of use our professional judgment in those instances to determine whether a control is relevant for our audit. So then now they give us a few examples also. So for instance, controls over completeness and accuracy of information produced by the entity might be relevant to us if we're using that information that they're providing. So let's say in our audit procedure, we're using a particular report and we're relying on the numbers of that report. So in order for us to make sure that report is accurate, we might test the internal controls on the preparation of that report to make sure that the report is providing us the right amounts. Also, controls around non-financial measures or non-financial data might be relevant to us if we're using certain reports of that non-financial data whenever we're doing analytical procedures. So we want to make sure that those reports are providing us the right non-financial data and that data is accurate. And in order to do that, we might test internal controls around the preparation of that report. And finally, they tell us that controls that relate to objectives that are not relevant to an audit should not be considered. So we can choose to pass over those whenever we're gaining an understanding of the internal controls. So we only need to gain an understanding of the internal controls that are relevant to the audit that we are performing. And as we saw in most of the examples, it is that we are making sure that reports that we're using perhaps in substantive procedures are accurate. And to do that, we're using tests of internal controls to ensure that those reports are produced accurately.